So I'm going to be talking about designing for human brains, and the reason I called it human brains instead of human psychology is really instead of talking about emotion and all that other stuff that more commonly is talked about in the design space, I want to talk more about human information processing. So how do we actually think and understand information, and how does that impact design? Because I am a researcher, we're going to start with an experiment. This is also an experiment for me. I've never done this before, so I don't know if it'll work. We're going to divide the room in half. So this will be the right side of the room, left side of the room. If you're in the middle, just decide wherever you feel loyal. And everyone just shut your eyes. Try not to fall asleep. And the right side of the room, open your eyes. Yours. So if your right side of the room, open your eyes, read the sentence on the screen, and try to just pay attention to the underlined word. And then shut your eyes. Good job. Left side of the room, your left. Now open your eyes, read this sentence on the screen, and pay attention to the underlined word. Don't write it down or anything weird. We'll come back to it. Shut your eyes. All right, now everyone can open your eyes again and hopefully keep them open for the rest of the talk. So who am I? Why am I even talking about this? I went to Old Dominion University for grad school. That's in Norfolk, Virginia. So I got a master's degree in experimental psychology and a PhD in Human Factors Psychology. How many of you are familiar with human factors? That's not bad at all, even for a UX space. That's pretty encouraging. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a slide or two, but I co-founded a user experience consulting company called Kennason in Albany, New York. Since February, I've been working full-time also for a startup called Agrilyst, which is an agriculture tech startup based in Brooklyn, which is an amazing product. We work with indoor farmers to help them better manage their crops and their facilities, and we're all about sustainability and healthy food and all that cool stuff. I volunteer with AIGA Upstate New York. That's another one of my hats, so shout out to AIGA people. And I actually write for the UserZoom blog. So it was what users do. Like Amanda mentioned, actually, they were recently acquired by UserZoom. So I write articles for UserZoom. Some of those are a little more intro-level stuff, so if that interests you, you can look that up, I guess. All right, so this picture is from probably the 1940s, and I would call this kind of a user experience research project. Not the way we usually think of it, right? But what I think they were doing is testing some kind of cockpit design or communication, something like that. And hey, they have a prototype. Not the way we usually make them, but a prototype just the same. And this is some early human factors research, so sorry to do this to you, but I can't help but lecture a little bit on the history of user experience, just because not everyone really knows about it. And when I talk about it, I like to start with the Industrial Revolution, the early 1900s. This is where researchers really started to think about how to make humans more productive. And it was more about thinking of people as machinery than it was actually thinking of them as humans, but that's a start, right? For example, research came out of this time period to say that the optimal weight for a shovel to shovel coal was something like 30 pounds, so they started designing shovels that held 30 pounds worth of coal, and people got faster at it. Cool. 1940s is when human factors and ergonomics became popular, so this was influenced by World War II very heavily. Again, researchers were thinking of people as part of a system, less about being human, more about being more efficient in a system. And this was also largely based on safety improvements. So a lot of human factors work to this day has to do with more safety critical environments. I worked in healthcare for a while doing research and design. It also has applications still in military and aviation and that kind of thing, but it's less about what the person thinks and more about just how to keep them safe and efficient. I like to throw this in there, which is not something that UX people maybe normally talk about, and it's the Disneyism of tech and entertainment that we saw around the 1950s and 60s when the Disney companies started building their theme parks. I love Disney Imagineering. It really fascinates me, and part of that is because they were combining technology with entertainment. So here we start talking about like delightful experiences, and again, they actually did some research in Disneyland about like how close should trash cans be to one another so people are less likely to litter, so behavioral stuff like that. All right, so here's where we start to get into those terms that are a little more familiar to UX. The 1980s, when computers became more widely accessible to people, researchers started talking about usability and human-computer interaction. And if you came from an academic background like I did, maybe this was also your introduction to user experience. And again, this was still kind of a focus on productivity and getting tasks done. Not so much about the experience per se, until I would say probably the 1990s, the World Wide Web. Suddenly there was a lot of competition for products, and as software became more accessible, and just we started becoming more connected and more connected with technology, and it became less about how well something works and how usable it is, and more, okay, but do people actually like using it? Because they could not and use something different. And now we're at the buzzwordification of UX, which is basically why we're all here. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to basically give a bunch of different examples of things that I find cool, that I kind of roughly categorize. And the first category is human attention. So I don't mean attention so much as like paying attention to a movie for 2 hours. I mean the very first stage of us processing information is you have to attend to it. Right? So before you even see what it is, your brain has to be like, oh, that exists. And this is a very old model of attention. But the point I want to show is that a lot of things influence like where our mental attention is directed at any time. Some of it is us directing it because we're looking for something or we're trying to accomplish a task. But the bottom row here, things like motion, color, orientation, intensity of a stimulus, these are things that are going to draw our attention. So outside of our control almost. It's like you see something shiny and you look at it. Not quite. But this makes sense because as cave people, to survive, we needed to be able to pick up on, say, motion. You needed to know if you were about to step on a rattlesnake or if a tree was going to fall on you, you had to move, right? Same thing with color, orientation, intensity. So something that sticks out from the environment is going to catch our attention. So why does that matter? Well, how often are you scrolling on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is, wasting time, and you get caught up in one of those recipe videos that just automatically plays, and like you don't care, you have no intention of making whatever that is, but you might sit and watch it for a few seconds or maybe even the whole video just because it kind of grabs your attention, right? So we can use some of these ideas for good, for directing attention. Subtle animations and things like that can help us communicate more effectively with our interfaces. We've had a lot of talk about color, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but using color contrast and things like that, you can create focal points, right? And you can direct people's attention that way. So the most important information basically should stand out. So after attention, we have visual perception. That just means our eyes sending messages to our brain and we make sense of what we're seeing. What do we see here? You see a cube, right? It's not actually there. It's our brain playing a trick on us. And visual illusions are really fun and they're everywhere and it's fun to give a million examples of them, but it's not really an example of our brain messing up. It's an example of how our brain works so seamlessly, like almost all of the time, that something like this can throw us off. Because something in nature that's like looks like straight lines, like it's going to be a connected object, right? Like how often would you run into something that's not? So we've evolved to work so efficiently with our vision that we can kind of be thrown off by these things. Or we can use them as designers to design things that make sense to the way people view things and understand things. This is not an illusion, but it is demonstrating kind of a principle. So how would you describe what you're seeing here? There's no wrong answer. Yeah. So we've talked about color. Now we're talking about kind of orientation. Some of these override other things. So orientation overrides color, actually. So you're more likely to see a straight across line and then a wavy one going through it. Although you could see it as a black line and a red line. But, typically you don't. Typically you see it as the straight across line exists. That's because that's how nature works again, right? So survival, evolution, that's how our eyes and our brain are helping us avoid predators and find food. So as a designer, you can use something like this. So this is 2 examples. The top example is from Amazon, straight across lines, and very subtly you get this psychological reaction that it's in order and the things in each row are related to one another. Beneath that is Pinterest. They don't do that. They use uneven cards, right? So it's more of that psychological feeling of just like a smattering of things put together. Very subtle, but very effective too. All right, now what do you see here? Would you say I see 12 circles? Or would you say I see 3 groups of 4 circles? Right? So that is another really powerful mechanism, is this grouping principle. We automatically think that things are close to one another, are related to one another, because that's how it is in nature, right? So Chris talked a lot about visualizations and dashboard design, so I'm not going to repeat all of that stuff, but hey, put related things together, right? That's an easy way to help clarify something that people are looking at. Put things that you need to compare or information that is similar to one another, put those close to one another. This example, I don't remember if that's Eventbrite. I think it is. But whatever it is, the information about the date and time of the event, right below that is a link to a calendar. That seems really obvious, but it might not be. Like when you're thinking about when this event is and you might want to go to it, you want to look at your calendar, right? So if you end up adding, putting that calendar link completely somewhere else on the page, you're going to make things a little more difficult for people. We've also had a lot of talk about different visual abilities, so I won't repeat that. But in addition to the examples we saw kind of from designer tools like Photoshop, is on the user side of things, Slack actually has themes that the user can pick that are specifically for people with different kinds of color blindness. So that is very visible to them, right? It's instead of making those design decisions, just behind closed doors and whatever, making sure something is readable by people with visual color blindness, you can show them like, oh, here, we're thinking about you. These are going to look good, regardless of your color blindness. Okay, so memory. So once you've paid attention to something, you've looked at it, and your brain understands what you're looking at, you kind of commit it to memory. So we rely on memory really for everything, but we rely a little bit more on shortcuts, right? If you remembered every single detail about everything you've ever seen, that would be really inefficient. So which penny is the real penny? You would think you'd be able to recognize a penny, right? And it's hard because we rely so much on just recognizing the thing. You're not like creating it from scratch. Any guesses though? It's actually G. Good job. So why are we talking about pennies? So because our memories rely so much on recognition, you have to be consistent with your interface. Now, we do talk a little bit about breaking rules and all that. That's super cool. But you have to remember that there is a balance to be struck, and your users are going to spend a whole lot more time using other products than they are yours, right? So if yours is different from all the other ones, yours is going to be the one that's hard to use. So, you want, people expect the logo or the home button over here. They expect search buttons, logins on that side of the screen. Sometimes it really makes sense to stick with those things. Another UX lesson for memory is to prompt for recognition if you can. So, if people need their username for whatever reason to input information, give it to them. Or if they need some other information that you can provide at the time that they need it, absolutely do that. Hulu reminds me all the time what I've started watching, otherwise I wouldn't remember. I've just watched The Office every single night. Amazon does this with things I've recently looked at. And part of that motivation, of course, is to get you to buy the thing. But just think of how you can use these things for good to help people. Sometimes that does help me. Like, oh yeah, I did need to buy that gift for that person. I better do that. All right, and I wanted to talk about social psychology a little bit because we are really social creatures. And again, for survival, that's been really important. As cave people, we depended on one another. We needed to have friends to have our back. And that's why you see a lot of things with social rewards and that little hint of dopamine that you get when you get a like or a notification or a message. Be mindful of ethical questions with that. I'm purposely keeping that a little vague. But when it comes to creating addictive experiences, be careful with that. But if it makes sense for your product to introduce some interactivity and some social components to that, absolutely feel free to do that. It's something that we tend to overall like. Sometimes we're inundated and we hate it, but something to consider. There is a book called The Media Equation. Has anyone heard of this book? I ran into it when I was writing my dissertation. It was written in the 90s, I want to say. And the whole idea behind this book, which is a little bit ahead of its time, is that we interact with technology very similarly to the way we interact with one another. So again, evolution, that's very ingrained, the way we interact with things, even if it's not like an actual real thing, even if it's a website. So the idea that interfaces are conversations comes from this idea of we kind of have these expectations of how we're going to interact with something based on how we interact with people. For example, if you ask somebody a question and they're thinking about it, you'll get some kind of visual indication yeah, all right, and they'll answer you. If you ask Google a question and nothing happened because there were no answers, you'd be like, what a rude little thing, right? You might not think that, but psychologically deep down you are. I promise, I'm an expert. So you can include some social human technology interaction. You can do this in a lot of really good positive ways. We're starting to get into some ethically questionable areas with this when it comes to, robots trying to sound like they're human. I should say people building robots to sound like they're human. Because, there is, again, a line there that you don't necessarily want to cross. But when you do this well, companion robots for the elderly or people with Alzheimer's or people with other disabilities who might benefit from that, that's a really cool use of technology. And that's a way of designing for people, designing for humans and the way we think and behave. Be careful of the chat bots and everything else, but make good choices. Okay, so both sides of the room, what was the word that I asked you guys to pay attention to? All right, I don't know if it worked, but so half of you saw a sentence that said the man's name was Baker. The other half of you saw a sentence that said the man worked as a baker. Now, my hypothesis, very, very scientific here. My hypothesis was that if you heard that the man worked as a baker, you were more likely to remember that word because there are so many things you could attach to that word, right? And what I'm getting at is storytelling. Because if you have such a simple sentence that says the man worked as a baker, You can like make up all kinds of things about him. You can imagine him with his little hat. You can think about how hungry you are. You can think about the last bakery you went to. Like, who even knows? If I tell you the man's name is Baker, you kind of just have to remember the person's name. So with more time in between the presentation of the word and me asking you, I bet we'd see a big difference. But stories are incredibly human. So this is a way that we naturally think about the world and make sense of things, even when we don't mean to. This is maybe the only piece of research I will talk about, and this is also from the 40s, so a very long time ago. These researchers showed participants a video of two triangles in a circle moving around this like square structure, and asked participants what they had seen. And overwhelmingly, participants came up with all kinds of stories about what they had seen. These things didn't talk. Like, all they did was kind of move around, but there were, a common one was the big triangle's the bully, the little triangle's protecting the circle, and they get into a fight, and someone hides in a house. Like, it's crazy. Or there were stories about, like, oh, the little ones are the kids, and the big triangle's the mom, and, like, all that stuff. But that is crazy that it's just so natural for us to attach meaning to things that we do, even, like, they're shapes. So use stories for good. So stories are very persuasive. That's come up a few times in a few people's talks today. Because that's going to be a really good way to get your message across in a way that's relatable and sticks with us. All right, so the last thing I want to do is talk a little bit about research methods and how we can take some concepts from psychology and help make our UX research better. And some of these things have been mentioned by other speakers, but we'll go over them anyway. The first I'll say is listen more than you speak. So psychologists are good at this, and hopefully UX researchers are good at this, right? You're there to listen. You're there to absorb information from your participants. You're there to not get in their way of what they are trying to say. You want to make sure they're comfortable talking and that you're not rushing them and all of those things. Recognize your biases. So today we talked a little bit about biases for participants and how to think about that, but like we all have our own biases too, so be mindful of that. Sometimes we you can't help it. Like, you're going to walk into something and have biases. You're going to have things that, like, you're trying to prove when you go into your testing, of course, and you just have to try to not let that show. So be neutral about your questions and that kind of thing. Talk to users in their natural habitat if you can. That might be Starbucks. I know there's not a lot of Starbucks around here. But if you're talking to surgeons, talk to them at the hospital. Whoever you're talking to, make sure it's in a place where they're comfortable, first of all. Inviting them to your office or your lab is not necessarily always the best way. And it gives you a chance to see not only maybe what tasks they're performing with whatever you're testing, but what their environment is like and how their communication might be with teammates and all those other things that give you a bigger picture of what's going on. Take time to really understand user goals and how they accomplish them. So experience mapping is one really good way of doing that. From Human Factors, we've done task analyses for decades and decades and decades, and that's kind of, it might look like something like this. So this is a task analysis for making a cup of tea. So they can get very complicated, but it's a useful tool for really, really, really understanding what the different steps are, what the blockers might be for each of those, and how they all relate to one another. Attach analytics or statistics whenever you can. So coming from academia, all the research I used to do was very statistics-based, and it doesn't have to be at that level, but numbers, depending on the stakeholders you're talking to, are going to be really important and persuasive. Combine that with stories, and you've got a winning combination. And finally, recognize that our goal is to design for humans. So it's designing for how our brains and bodies have evolved, right? So you think of Ergonomics is something that people recognize, the fancy chair you sit in. The whole idea behind ergonomics is you're designing for the way the human body is built. It's as simple as that, right? Like our wrists are not meant to use laptop trackpads like this all day. That's why we all have carpal tunnel syndrome. But it's the same thing with your brain. So you're also designing for the way our human brain has evolved for a really long time. So be mindful of that. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much.